Welcome to a special interview series commemorating 40 years of Lambda Scholarship Foundation Canada. In honor of this milestone, we're diving into the rich and complex history of an organization that has played a pivotal role in supporting the evolving needs of 2S LGBTQIA+ communities in Canada. Through candid conversations with some of the key players who helped shape the organization, this project aims to preserve and present the stories that define Lambda's legacy. These interviews offer space for reflection, celebration, and insight, offering a vivid portrait of the Foundation's evolution and its ongoing commitment to advancing equity in academic research, financial support, and education. For this interview, I sat down with Barb Freeman. Barb served as president of Lambda Scholarship Foundation Canada from 2011 to 2018, where she played a pivotal role expanding support for LGBTQ+ students and researchers across Canadian universities. She came out privately in 1975 through the Ottawa Women's Centre and Lesbians of Ottawa Now, marking the beginning of a lifelong commitment to advocacy. As both a radio journalist and a journalism professor, Barb championed more equitable media representation of women and LGBTQ+ communities. During her tenure at Lambda, Barb significantly broadened its reach and impact, working to establish new scholarships and ensuring the stability and sustainability of its established awards. Let's hear our conversation. So, hi, Barb. Thanks for joining me today. I have a lot of questions for you about your time with Lambda, so I just want to dive in, but I want to start with before you came to Lambda. So, a little bit about you and who you are. I know that, you came out personally in 1975, but only publicly years later. At the time, you were working as a journalist in Ottawa. And I'm kind of curious to know what it was like for you navigating the early days of LGBTQ liberation in Canada from, within the newsroom while you were still not out, especially, under the expectation to remain objective, even when reporting on issues that affected your own rights.
Well, I just had to be a professional about it. And if I could give you an example, a brief one, there was a scandal supposedly about a male prostitution ring in Ottawa that the police made a big announcement about. And I was working at the CBC at the time, and I had access to comments from Gays of Ottawa, as it was known then. They were saying that basically most of what the police were saying was not true, and they were, by publishing the names of the men who were arrested, that they were causing a lot of pain. Anyway, I went to my editor about this, and I said, well, we have the main story from the police, now here's the other side. And he said, well, I don't want to give those queers any publicity. And in those days, queers was not a nice word. And I basically said, but aren't we supposed to cover all sides of the story? And he relented. And for him, it was just a gut reaction. It didn't take him long to reconsider. But that was an example of some of the attitudes, especially among men, that were happening. And that was in the CBC, which is a fairly liberal place by and large. But there were individuals who took a little while. I did it without revealing myself. So that's how I managed those things. It was hard personally for me because I was afraid of being found out. Because in those days, you could lose your job. Although I don't think anybody ever lost their job at the CBC for being gay or lesbian.
You finally came out
around,
what year?
Well, it was 1975, but completely. It was
publicly?
really, really gradual. I came out to my family early because I didn't want them to find out from somebody else. I didn't want anyone trying to blackmail me. We'll tell your family, blah, blah, blah. So I told them early. It was friends, and then I think my feminist friends at Carleton in my faculty and others knew. And I suppose by that time everybody knows, because if one person knows, they all know. I never came out to my students for, a long time. And that was because I was there, I felt, to teach them journalism. I was there to teach them journalism history. I wasn't there to talk about me. And so that was my take on it at the time. And recently I visited a colleague who's got, God love him, he's got rainbows all over his room, and he's very out. And I love him for it, and I told him I couldn't do that when I was here. I didn't feel like this was at Carleton.
I attended Concordia, the journalism program there in the 90s, and I remember that too. I wasn't really sure if I should or shouldn't be out at the time. But I did write a few stories. I definitely did write a few stories. So it's interesting to see how the times have changed. Yeah. You began to teach journalism like you said, at
Yeah.
Carleton in the early 80s. I'm kind of curious, though, what drew your transition into academia, and how did your lived experience also shape your teaching?
It was supposed to be a 1-year contract. I had been working in private radio at the time. A certain person in there who was a sexual harasser. And I thought, I'm not putting up with this any longer. I'm going to leave. And I found another job and then I left. And so at Carleton, I was an instructor and it was a year-to-year thing until year 4. So, and at the time, I was pretty afraid of being exposed. I remember saying to me, wait until you make tenure as an assistant professor before you come out. Of course, there were gay people at Carleton, and the women who I knew there tended to be more open than the men, interestingly enough, at Carleton at the time. But, it was the 80s. It was still pretty conservative and slow. As I say, I never came out to my students. There was one student who discovered that I was and kind of saw me and sneered at me. I mean, literally sneered at me. And that was very hurtful because she was a good student and we've had a decent rapport as professor and student. And I was quite disappointed. But, I kept on going. What else could I do? On the other hand, I would see some of my students covering gay stuff. And I knew that kid was probably gay, And I did give the ones I knew were gay some very quiet support. And I came out to them. But that was all I did because they were afraid too. Because, you could still lose your job. You could still lose the roof over your head. You could still, have your whole future compromised. So I really wasn't one of those brave activists who ran around waving flags and things. I tried to bring around change from the inside by trying to be more inclusive in the way I taught. In my style guides, when I started teaching journalism history, talking about diversity in the media from way back and all of that stuff. I mean, it was brave to be by gender, I mean a women's rights activist, a feminist in academia those days, let alone being, an out lesbian. So I wasn't ready for that. And it took me until I realized that my students were much more accepting. And that didn't really start happening until after 2000. And what happened for me was I was already on the Lambda board in the mid 2000, and I can't remember when I first joined, probably 2008 or 9. And so I was in the process, and I was also actually almost retired, but I got married to my spouse in 2006 after 25 years together, and I put our wedding picture on a shelf in my office. And one of my grad students came in one day. She was brand new, and we were introducing ourselves, and she saw the picture, and she went over there, and she said, "Oh, what's this?" And I said, "Well, that's my partner. We got married, and that's our wedding photo." And she said, "Oh, really? Congratulations." And she was so warm, and just, I thought, this is great. And then I did a photo op for one of the, it was a Carleton publication, and the kids had me standing. They wanted a photo illustration of two women's holding hands. It was about same-sex marriage, so it was around the same time. And they recruited one of my straight colleagues and myself to stand in the hallway and hold hands while they took photographs. And I always thought and I had a pinky ring at the time, which back in the day, a lot of lesbians wore as a secret symbol, and I had worn it. But anyway, I had it on then, and they wanted me to take it off. It was next to my wedding ring. Maybe it didn't look so great. And I said, no, you have to keep that on because that is symbolic of lesbian life from the old days. So I felt pretty comfortable, A straight colleague took it all with, her usual humor, and it was fine. Yeah. So that was when I became a lot more relaxed.
You speak a lot about the relationships or interactions you had with students over the years. And Carleton was one of the first universities to receive a Lambda Scholarship, right? And I'm kind of curious, what the environment was like for LGBTQ students, LGBTQ plus students, when you were teaching there. Did you notice any challenges? You did kind of allude to that a bit, but the fear of being outed. But did you notice any challenges they faced in being fully themselves on campus?
Not that I was aware of in the sense of witnessing anything. I was mostly in my classroom or in my office and, around my building, which was then kind of separate from the rest of the campus. So I didn't see a lot going on. I had one student many years ago who came to me. Well, she was kind of troubled. I knew there was something wrong. And my gaydar went off, and I sat her down one day and I said, "Now, how are you doing? And is everything fine with you?" and all that. And very, very slowly she came out with a story that she and her partner were very isolated and they were scared, and her partner was starting to date men because she wanted to cover, and maybe she should go back to men after all. And my poor student was beside herself and didn't know what to do, you know. And this was an example of the early days. Later on, as I say, there were some who were more out. I had a very dear student, a young man who died of AIDS around 1986. And he said to me, I went to visit him in the hospital, and he said, "Listen, don't let anyone know I died of AIDS." And I said, "Why?" And he said, "Because I don't want people feeling sorry for me." And of course, that was before the medication that made life worth living after, you became HIV positive. It was a death sentence, and he died shortly after. So it was different from "don't tell anybody I'm gay," but it was the same sort of idea, I think, that there was a lot of pain involved.
Yeah.
Later on, I think it just became easier. They had LGBT centers on campus for the students. I had support from other lesbian professors and one or two gay guys. Trans folk weren't on the radar at the time that we knew about, because there was nobody sort of who had just transitioned and needed support as far as I knew.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about Lambda now. Like with so many others, you were brought into the fold by Gary Seeley. And I'm kind of curious, like, what some of your earliest memories of him are. Like, how did the two of you meet?
I don't quite remember how we met. I think I knew Hugh Nelson first. It could have been Hugh through EGAL, perhaps, or one of the other organizations. Anyway, we all wind up at parties somewhere, so I'm pretty sure that I met Gary at a party, because that's where he made a lot of his connections. And he was always looking to make connections with people. And then he invited me out for coffee, and he said, "Would you contribute to the new scholarship I'm trying to set up at?" And I said, "Well, sure," because I was teaching at Carleton at the time. And the concern that Gary had at the time, and I as a board member when I joined at his invitation soon afterwards, the concern was that there wasn't recognition of LGBTQ plus research anywhere in academia. It would sideline you if you tried it. It wasn't rewarded. It wasn't really encouraged as far as we could see. And Gary and his colleagues wanted to set up a system whereby people would be rewarded for doing research into rainbow issues. And you didn't have to be gay or bi or lesbian to do the work, as long as you're an ally, of course. And so that's how it started for them. They first set one up at Ottawa U, and then I think we were next at Carleton. And I don't know how it was that Gary asked me to join the board, but he probably called me and asked me. And I joined it briefly for a little while, I think in the 80s, and then I left and came back in around 2008 or so, I think. So maybe it was the early 90s I first served. I can't remember because I wasn't there that long. But anyway, by the time I got back, LGBTQ plus research was being honored, but we still felt Gary wanted to build 20 scholarships across the country. That was his goal. I think we got to 10 before he passed away. I've just been looking at the website today, and now I think there are about 4 more or 5, and it's been great. And they're going into things that we didn't do. We did mostly the research at the time because that was the priority. Now they're doing tuition as well, and I'm really glad to see that. We set up the Candace Graham Award while I was on the board, as I recall, and that was award at UVic. And I knew Candace personally when she lived in Ottawa. So in some instances, we knew the people after whom the awards are named, Not all of them have a name on them, but we started putting names on some of them as well to honor people who had worked very hard for rainbow research, and that included Gary. So when I was on the board and Gary wasn't, I put his name on the award, the Gary Seeley and Friends of Lambda Award. We did the same at UVic. Nicola Violette, who was one of our first award winners at Ottawa U and had done so much in the area of rainbow rights for refugees in her law faculty. She was a real trendsetter. Unfortunately, she died in 2005 of cancer, 2015 of cancer. But we named it for her before she died, and that was one of the things I wanted to do because I knew Nicole as well.
So I mean, like, when Lambda first started, it was a bit of a social group, largely from a lot of the files that we have here. Before it became, and then it became recognized human rights. The people who were working in the human rights realm before it got into the schools. You worked as a volunteer for a while, like you were saying, before becoming president. Do you remember though what it was like when you were kind of walking in at that time? Because it was kind of going under like a lot of change, I imagine, at that time that you were joining the board.
Yes, it had been through a lot of change, and my memory is a little fuzzy, but I know they tried different executive models at one point, and that was one of the reasons I left, because I didn't like the executive model that was passed or the way it was done, because it was sort of an executive of the board making the decisions and then the rest of us. And because I've been used to working in feminist organizations, I didn't like that model at all. So I left. But I know Gary's and other people spent a lot of time just trying to keep Lambda alive at one point. And it just needed, I think, a focus that would attract donors. And it wasn't hard to persuade them that we wanted to honor our writers, which we did with the Wild About Sappho Awards. I'm sure other people have talked to you about that. And we wanted to do it in the academic field because a lot of our donors were older people, professional people who've been around for a while, and they understood the importance of research to get things done, to get changes made in our society, to get new policies, And that's what it was all aimed at, to give people a start to go on and do great things. And that's what Nicole Violette did. She started with a Lambda scholarship to help her finish one of her major projects, and then she just took off from there. So that's what we wanted, and that's what our donors wanted at the time.
Being in Ottawa, like, you also had proximity to the federal government and members of parliament. Like, did Lambda try to build relationships also with some civil servants during your time?
Oh, yes. A lot of the people who supported Lambda were civil servants, chatted up politicians and got some of their support sometimes, especially NDP, but not just NDP, Liberals, Conservatives. Gary Seeley, as I said, was a great guy for making connections, and he believed in connections. He wrote it down as part of our mandate. We have to make connections. And he did that all the time. And as chair of the board, he expected a lot from us. Gary loved to dream big, and, he would come up with 50 things we should do in 50 days. And of course, we only got 1 or 2 things done. But it was an exciting time because we found our feet and we started going. And I'm so pleased when I look at Lambda now. Since I left, they've just kept on going and have done some wonderful things. And I'm so proud of Lambda, really, and everybody associated with it.
Can you speak to us a little bit about what it was like to be on the board? Like, how did the board operate? What were your meetings like during those days? All on volunteer, of course.
Well, at first it's all volunteer, and we did it on the telephone initially because we weren't all in Ottawa. We had at least one person out in BC, Bill Turner, who took care of the one high school award we had and still have. And we had people in Toronto, I think, at one point, and Tuan Vu, the longtime treasurer, was in Montreal. And the rest of us were in Ottawa. And when I was on the board the second time, Pat McKenna was our administrator, and she was in Victoria. Sandy Bonini, our bookkeeper, was in Ottawa, and all these people were working together as either on the board or support people like Sandy, to make sure we were doing everything right. And that's basically how it ran. And we would set up an agenda. Gary would set up an agenda. Pat would set it around. And we would go through each item. Okay, we need to raise more money for such an award. Or, for example, when I was on the board the second time, the award at University of New Brunswick had not been given out for quite a while. And it just so happened that I was going down there for a conference, academic conference. So I went to see a gay man there who was one of our connections at the university, and he and I arranged a meeting with the dean in charge of research, or the associate dean, I can't remember now who it was, but anyway, and said, we've got a problem. People are not applying. Why are they not applying? They're not being encouraged is really why, because the other piece of Lambda was that academics in the know would let people who were doing rainbow research or who wanted to let them know that there was an award if there was at their school. And the other thing we were trying to do at the time was build more research awards. So Grant Halley, this wonderful guy in Sudbury, ran an antique store, and he would put some money aside from his profits, and he built up an endowment for Laurentian University, the Grant Halley Award. So, there were people who really worked hard to raise money for Lambda, not just people on the board. And then we had a couple of people who wanted to set up anonymous donors, for example, who wanted to set up awards as well or contribute to awards. Yeah, we still had anonymous donors, and we had to honor their privacy, but some of them were extremely generous. So the University of Alberta Award was the last one I was involved in setting up. That's the STEM Award for undergraduate students. Yeah, it was very rewarding time, if I could use that pun, to be part of Lambda, because we did build on what Gary and his colleagues and predecessors had tried to do. As I was leaving the board, the last 3 or 4 years, a number of trans people showed up to do research, and that was very cool because they hadn't before, and they started, winning awards for their research as well, or their writing, and so on. Difficulties on the board, you were asking me about that?
Or just maybe challenges maybe that you faced during your tenure.
Well, the main challenges we faced during my tenure there, I think, was just keeping up with making sure all the awards had enough money in them. A lot of it was just everyday administrative stuff. I found it personally difficult when Pat McKenna stopped being our administrator. She had other things to do because I basically administered the board, and it was a lot of work. So I asked my colleagues on the board to take a piece and do what they did best. And so everybody took a little piece and did a specific task on the board. So, for example, one person would check with the Francophone programs to make sure that their award was up to scratch, and somebody else would do the Anglophone ones. And we would, of course, have to reach out to the winners. And that was one of the best things about Lambda, was that you would get this young person and you were able to tell them they won this award, and they were so happy. They were able to do all kinds of stuff. There was one young woman who went to Russia to do a project on the way that rainbow people were being oppressed in Russia. That's just one example. So I know you're asking me for difficulties, but really it was just the day-to-day grind that all administrators run into. I can't think of anything, and just making sure that our donors were still with us, which meant trying to keep in touch with them, through our annual newsletter, at least, if nothing else. I think that the biggest challenge was trying to keep a really good social media presence, which wasn't quite as demanding then as it is now, but still, I think we fell a bit behind on that from time to time. Because you're also, when you're working with volunteers, people have full-time jobs, people are doing other things, and, they can't always manage that. But I'm really glad to see now that they seem to be on top of social media, and that's great.
You'd mentioned one of the great things was being able to call the recipients and let them know. Did you stay in touch with some of them over time, or I don't know, did you even get a sense really of what it meant to have this type of recognition?
Well, they would write us thank you notes, and they would tell us how grateful they were, and they weren't huge awards. They were $1,000 mostly, maybe $2, but it meant a lot to them to be able to go and just, oh, good, I've got the money to travel there now. So in the case of the young woman who went to Russia, for example, or I've got a chance to add several more people to my database, or whatever it happens to be. And of course, when somebody won the tuition award, that was great too. I should amend something. We weren't necessarily the ones that told them that they won the Lambda Award. The awards committee at the university would have let them know, probably through the director of their program. But we got to know, of course. They sent notices to us as to who won the award that year. And we would try to publicize the award winners if they wanted us to do so. Most of them were fine with it.
Looking back as like a former president, are there certain accomplishments that you're particularly proud of?
Yes, I think just building on with the board, just building on what Gary and the others had started. We did manage to add 2 or 3 awards. 1 or 2 turned out to be short term, but that was fine. That was a tuition award. But others came and filled another gap. That was mainly it. And I also always got a kick out of the high school award out on Salt Spring Island because the kids are so keen. And it was nice to see them caring about diversity issues and human rights issues because it was basically a human rights award. And that was kind of neat. And we had a wonderful guy who's passed away now, Bill Turner, who was for a long time our representative out there. He was later joined by Chris Fox, who's a great friend of mine. She joined later, and she kept an eye on the Candace Graham and the one in Vancouver at St. Paul Hospital. Bill kept an eye on the high school award on Salt Spring, and he was always there to give it out every year. He was there to give it out, which was very cool. He was a former teacher at that school, and he wanted to make sure that that award continued. So just getting the awards out, I think, and just being able to diversify a little bit in the kinds of awards that we were giving out, because we realized that when you are the original awards were endowments, and you had to raise about $30,000 for an endowment, so that the money it made on the market every year, the university would invest it. Whatever they made would go toward the actual award, and then we kept the capital to make sure we generated more awards, or I should say the university did. And that worked for a while, but it didn't. As the market started to tighten up around 2008, we were realizing that maybe that's not the way we should go all the time unless somebody wants to endow an award. Maybe we should think more about short-term research awards or short-term tuition awards, that are awarded every year. Somebody gives $2,000 or $3,000 in their name for a little while, and that student gets to go to school or gets to do that extra piece of research or whatever. So we have at Lambda, we had a different kinds of awards by the time I left, and it was partly in response to the market situation.
Like, in your view, what role do scholarships and academic support play in LGBTQ plus liberation? Or does it play a role? But do you see this as being something that really kind of is changing things for the next generations?
I think it did. I think it was one of the factors that made rainbow research acceptable and even respected in academic circles. It didn't mean that if it was rainbow project that it automatically got the okay. It was still scrutinized by the academics at the university to make sure it was viable and so on. But it just added to the acceptance, I think, of rainbow people, because in academia, like when I started, there wasn't a whole lot. And by the time I left, there was, and it was partly because people's attitudes changed among the faculty and among the world at large. Now people wanted to know what made things tick. Form of social work approach might work better with survivors of HIV, just for an example. You know what I mean? It just added to the general acceptance, I think. We made our contribution to the overall picture, I think.
Do you have advice for, to offer young LGBTQ plus people today who are entering maybe journalism or academia?
Just keep on doing what you're doing and don't let the current political situation, especially in the States, even if some of it does leak over the border, try not to let that affect you in your courage to present your work to your colleagues and to your classmates. Sometimes that's the biggest barrier. To your professors, so that you can carry on with your dream to get something done that you feel should be done in terms of your academic work, or just getting yourself through college and university. We did try to extend our awards to community college, by the way, and the way they were setting up their acceptance programs by computer, however they did it, is that they were looking for people who were low income and people who were high marks. LGBTQ plus 2S did not factor into it because that was too personal and they couldn't ask people those questions. That was the reason I was given. But we really tried to set something up at Algonquin. So it's very difficult sometimes to get around the administration's rules. Maybe they'll try again. Maybe they've changed again. I don't know. But we always thought that maybe it's time for people who were doing trades to also have the same opportunities.
You know, you led the organization at a very important time. You saw a lot of change during the time that you were there. Here we are, 40 years. There is a new president, and then there'll be even another president, I understand too. And there's Wild About Sappho as well, is from what I understand coming back to this fall. What are your hopes for the future of the organization, maybe in the decade towards their 50th anniversary celebration?
Well, just keep on producing research awards, tuition awards. I think tuition awards right now are just as important because, it's hard for people to find a roof over their heads that they can afford. It's hard for young people to get jobs, enough jobs to keep them going. And so if they get a break on their tuition, all the better. Wild About Sappho, I wish it success. The only reason we stopped it back in the day in 2009, and I remember Gary Seeley persuading us to stop, is because we're putting a lot of effort into a project that actually got us very, very little in the way of money. And maybe we were running it wrong. I don't know. But that's why we quit. So if they can come up with a new formula that would be a money maker as well, I think that would be a great idea. I'd go. For sure.
I'm asking people to share also like their memories of Gary. You've mentioned him several times here, and he sounds like such a wonderful man. Looking back, like the people that you got to meet, you also talk about Nicole Laviolette. Do you have any kind of memories of some of the people that you've met over the years that became very important in your life?
I mean, with Lambda? Gee, I've got a whole...
I guess through Lambda. I guess like maybe connections made through Lambda.
But through Lambda. Well, yes. I became friends with Bill Turner on Salt Spring. Chris Fox, I think I knew already in Victoria through the lesbian grapevine. Brian Ray I met because he was on the board representing Ottawa U at one point. Sandy Bonini, who was our bookkeeper for a long time. The wonderful Cameron Aitken. He came in as a director just before I left, and then he became wonderful as president. He really has. He's done a lot with Lambda, and the boards that he's worked with have as well. And before him, there was Pat Gentili, who took it over for a couple of years, and she had made it quite clear she was going to do it for a couple of years because she had other things to do, and that was fair enough. But she did generously give of her time to Lambda for the couple of years she could manage. Sarah Bannerman, who was actually a former student at Carleton, not of mine, but in the communications program, but I met her way back then, and I recruited her for the board, and I'm glad I did because she's a brilliant scholar, and she's also done, I think, a lot for Lambda. And Jacob Schweda, I don't know what happened to Jacob, but he was on the board for a while. He was a really bright, keen young man. And there's so many others, Mike Graydon's a buddy of mine. So if they weren't friends of mine when I started, they were certainly friends of mine when I finished, and that was kind of cool. And Tuan Vu has always been there solid until I think very recently. But he was treasurer for years and years, and just kept us on track, what we could do and what we couldn't do and what we should do. Kept track of all the money that we had and all the money that we needed. Yeah, you asked me about Gary. Like I say, Gary was a force to be reckoned with. I will tell you frankly, sometimes he drove me nuts. I knew what he was doing and I knew what he wanted us to do, but he tended to basically run the meeting with a list of demands, and some of which we could do and some of which we couldn't. But he was, in many ways, a very generous guy, and he expected generosity from other people, not just in terms of money, but in terms of effort, and I guess that's fair enough.
Barb, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to share your memories with us about Lambda. It's greatly appreciated. We hope that these stories inspire and deepen your understanding of Lambda Scholarship Foundation's legacy and enduring impact. And if you enjoyed this conversation I've had with Barb, please don't miss the other interviews we've posted as part of the 40th anniversary project. There are plenty more to discover. So thank you. Thank you again, Barb.
You're welcome. It's been my pleasure.